The first two-thirds of this episode of Approaching Lightspeed is a refresher or a introductory course on the world of the Expanse. But the last third is sort of a look at what the people who have watched the TV show can expect given where the show leaves off. And naturally, to talk about things that happen so late in the series, I'm going to have to spoil earlier installments of the Expanse. For those of you who haven't read the first 6 books in the Expanse series or haven't seen the TV show, I will give you plenty of warning before we start getting into spoiler territory. And you can use your judgment on whether you want to hear what comes next or not. So without further ado, I welcome you to the first part in our 2-part Expanse Spectacular.
Be advised. We are approaching Lightspeed.
Anybody who's ever had a single conversation with me knows that I have an evangelical love and adoration for the Expanse series. It's cast a pretty massive shadow over the podcast already, I guess in only a way that I would know how, but it's essentially the litmus test that I compare all other fiction against nowadays. You know, like, if it's half as good as The Expanse, then I will enjoy it kind of stuff. And also in a more literal way in that I used all of the hardcovers as the stack of books that I would put my microphone on top of, and that would sort of be my stand-in for a more professional equipment like a tripod. I've since gotten a nice desk-mounted boom arm so that haphazard pile of books that blocks my keyboard has been done away with. But it's pretty safe to say that I hold The Expanse in fairly high regard. So, The Expanse is a book series that was written by James S.A. Corey, which is the pen name under which the authors Daniel Abraham and Ty Frank operate. It was adapted for TV and it played on the Sci-Fi channel before it was canceled, and then there was this huge fan campaign to bring it back, and then ultimately Amazon purchased the rights to the show and aired it from there. And recently, the show ended with its 6th and final season. But here's the thing. The show only adapted the first 6 books in the Expanse series, and there are 9 of them in total, which means that there are 3 books of material that just went completely unaddressed by the show. And there are pretty substantial loose ends that are left open in the show, presumably in the hopes of one day adapting it to the screen. But a lot of fans are sitting there scratching their heads right now thinking, well, what in the world happens next? And am I ever going to see what happens next? Well, you're in luck, because if you count yourself amongst that number, I'm here to whet your appetite a little bit. And if you don't count yourself amongst that number, and if you have never heard of The Expanse a day in your life, then you're also in luck, because I'm about to give you a bit of an introduction to what I consider to be the best fictional thing I've ever seen, be it movie, TV, video games, books, you name it. This is my personal favorite, and maybe it can be yours as well. So as I said in the introductory mission statement episode of this podcast, I'm here to talk about the merits and the differences of lesser known aspects of science fiction, such as those found in books. And I feel like the current situation with The Expanse is a perfect encapsulation of that. You have a whole entire fandom of people who have watched and loved this TV show and have fallen in love with its characters and its world, but a significant subset of them have no idea what happens next and how it all culminates and comes together, because they might not have known the books existed or might not have ever given reading a try before and might not know how enjoyable it can be. We're going to get into what the TV viewers can expect from the post-Babylon's Ashes era of The Expanse's story, but first I want to give a bit of an overview of the series as a whole for the uninitiated. The Expanse has very often been described as Game of Thrones in space, or the science fictional equivalent to A Song of Ice and Fire. And I think that's partially because of the two authors' relationship with George R. R. Martin himself, but also, I guess, due to this penchant by publishers to label their newest product as the successor of an extremely popular property that came before. It kind of harkens back to maybe a less good-natured and kind-hearted example from back in the early 2000s when Sony's Killzone was supposed to be the Halo killer. And by the way, this isn't to say that the people who compare The Expanse to A Song of Ice and Fire aren't onto something, because they are. They're two very similar series in terms of themes and focuses on politics and the grand scale of their world building. But I still feel like comparing it to A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones might be a little reductive and might give a newcomer the wrong idea. In A Song of Ice and Fire, George R. R. Martin went through great pains to detail 300 years worth of lineage of all of the Westerosi kings and thousands more years of history of every other corner of his world. And most of that history and backstory he writes is exactly that. It's backstory. It's there to give context to the present day situations that he's trying to describe. And he details it masterfully, by the way, especially in his World of Ice and Fire book. But The Expanse is stealthier in its ambitions. It's not until you're several books into the series that you look back on everything and on where it all started that you see the full picture of just how much ground you've covered. So while The Expanse is absolutely worthy of the lofty comparisons to A Song of Ice and Fire, I feel like something more appropriate would be not necessarily to a history textbook, but to a sort of accounting through multiple points of view of one of the most turbulent periods of human history. Imagine a volume that details the lives of a select group of people and follows them over the course of, say, from the prelude to World War I to the conclusion of World War II. Think of all of the change, both in the lives of these characters and in the greater scope of the world that occurs over that time. Think of all the tragedy and all of the feats of heroism and humanity that unfolds over the course of such a volume. Think of all of the change that comes simply from the technological developments that we make over the course of such a period of time. That's kind of what The Expanse as a series tackles. It's basically like historical fiction for a period that hasn't happened yet, but it's told in such a plausible and realistic way that you can kind of almost picture this actually being humanity's real future. Mind you, obviously, all that is nowhere near as marketable as saying it's the next Song of Ice and Fire, but I want to sort of drive home to you that the series has a scope that sort of creeps up on you, and you don't exactly realize what you're getting into when you first pop open Leviathan Wakes, the first book in the series, not to be confused with Leviathan Falls, which is the final book in the series. Leviathan Wakes introduces us to a world that is eerily similar in a lot of respects to the world that we inhabit today, as is tradition for all the best science fiction that has come before it. In the future, humanity has colonized Mars and the asteroid belt, as well as a few of the moons that orbit Jupiter and Saturn. And all of the societies that arise in these places are as separate from one another ideologically as they are physically. And it's through this setting that James S. A. Corey breaks out their very potent brand of social commentary. In this future, Earth is a very well-established and ancient power. Billions upon billions of people live on this world that can barely sustain the population. We've grown stagnant in a way. The authors compare Earth of this time period to the Roman Empire on the eve of its decline and fall. The people of Mars, on the other hand, are new players on this field, and their whole entire society is built around terraforming the Red Planet and further establishing its independence from Earth's grasp. As a civilization, the Martians have a pretty big chip on their shoulder. There's a lot of societal memory of the time where they languished underneath Earth as one of their colonies. They were heavily exploited for resources that were meant to feed and sustain humanity's fading homeworld. And ever since gaining their independence 150 years before the start of the story, Mars has been hell-bent on maintaining said independence. As a result, Mars is heavily militarized and is every bit as proficient in warfare as Earth is. Earth might have a larger navy, but Mars has ships that are far more powerful, and they are more than willing and more than able to face Earth in any hypothetical conflict that should arise. And in a sort of tragic but ironic twist of events, in escaping Earth's dominion, the people of Mars came to languish under their own authoritarian regime. They're bombarded with endless propaganda about the lazy and leeching imperialists that live on Earth, as well as the grand hopes of the terraforming project that will make the Red Planet into a livable world. And all this is complete with compulsory drafts into either the terraforming project or into the military in what can only be a measure to curb Earth's continued influence in the solar system. The two planets exist in this perpetual state of Cold War, despite the official narrative being that they work as part of a coalition. And it's a huge fear amongst the people of the solar system that the tensions between the two will finally explode into actual warfare. And the people who would get caught in the middle of this endgame scenario would be the Belters, who are the inhabitants of stations that were built in the asteroid belt and in the moons of the gas giants. To Earth and Mars, which are known as the inner planets, the Belters are little more than a disposable workforce to be exploited for their own benefit. There's a vast amount of material wealth and resources to be had in the asteroid belt in the form of precious metals and water, and the Belters are the means by which the inner planets access said wealth. And this is done without any consideration whatsoever for the health or well-being of the Belters. And to make matters even worse, there are some pretty substantial physical differences that exist between people native to the belt and those who come from the inner planets. And these form, as you might imagine, a pretty serious barrier to understanding between the two peoples. I mean, look at the way that even today's society treats people who are considered to be outside the main group, or in some cases, minorities. You know, this kind of marginalization isn't exactly a new thing, and The Expanse paints a pretty grim picture of that kind of marginalization still being a very real thing, even, 300 or 400 years into the future. For example, a lot of inners are pretty prone to using the slur skinnies, which describes a stereotypical Belter's appearance. The average Belter came up in pretty weak artificial gravity, which means that their skeletons have been elongated and made fragile as a result. It's not uncommon to find a Belter that is well over 7 feet in height. And also, because of this, they also suffer from horrible birth defects at times. There seems to be an underlying attitude amongst the inners that the Belters are not even human anymore, but a distinct and oftentimes, unfortunately, lesser race. And the worst part is that even if a Belter, for whatever reason, wanted to visit one of the planets they spend their entire lives in involuntary servitude to, they would very quickly suffer major organ failure because the gravity of these planets is so intense on their unadapted bodies. Even if the ills humans visit upon one another and social concerns weren't a factor here, the environment and the work Belters find themselves in and doing is not really conducive to a long and healthy life. It's an inescapable sentence that you're condemned with just in being born in one of these stations, and there's no alternative because of the limitations present in your very body. The Belters are this desperate underclass that suffers at the whims of Earth and Mars. And if ever they try to stand up to this mistreatment or demonstrate against it, or in some cases militarily rise up, whatever they do, the inners are absolutely ruthless in putting down any dissent. Those kinds of tensions and that sort of society-wide hatred that the inners are seeding in the Belters doesn't really have a way of staying quiet forever. And while Earth and Mars are busy with their big rivalry, they might find that their treatment of the Belters might one day come back to haunt them. And honestly, it seems like even the inners know that, given how brutal they are in putting down any real or perceived Belter uprising. It all sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? Geopolitical and social dynamics like the one I just described are a dime a dozen throughout human history. The Expanse does such a good job of taking all of the atrocities and problems and different facets, whether they be positive or negative, of humanity and porting them into this futuristic setting. I mean, the whole situation between Earth and Mars, has pretty distinct echoes to post-World War II relations between the Soviet Union and the United States. And maybe the belt could stand in as the smaller countries that they would use as proxies against one another. And even without all of the highbrow, abstract history talk, there's still the more universal experiences of the demonization and the dehumanization of entire groups of people, and the ease with which cultures and populations can be weaponized against one another. The thing that really seals the authenticity of this setting for me, though, is the scientific realism. Daniel Abraham and Ty Frank went the extra mile in making sure this setting is as grounded as something that takes place in space can be. For example, they established right off the bat that there is no faster-than-light travel in this universe. If you want to get anywhere in the solar system, you better be ready for a trip that'll take at least a few months. And since there's no faster-than-light technology, this also means that communications are a problem, because if you're sending a message between Earth and Mars, it can take up to 20 minutes for that message to get to Mars, and then it could take up to another 20 minutes for Mars's message to get back to you. Which means that characters are usually very much in the dark about events that are going on, even light minutes beyond their immediate perception. There's also no advanced gravity manipulation technology. The way that belters or the crews of spaceships make their gravity is through artificial means such as spin gravity or thrust gravity. And they do something very creative with the latter. In the ships of the Expanse, rather than being arranged the way a boat or a warship would be on Earth, the decks are stacked on top of one another so that the ship sort of resembles an office building, with the ship's thruster or main drive being at the bottom of this arrangement. This means that when the main drive lights up and starts pushing the ship, that acceleration weighs the whole crew down and keeps their boots to the deck. This makes for some pretty crazy action sequences and space battles throughout the series, because when you're trying to dodge railgun rounds or torpedoes, you need to be executing some pretty gnarly maneuvers. But since there's no gravity manipulation technology, that means your crew's going to be getting jostled about quite a bit depending on how violently you move the ship. The threat of one of your crew members having a stroke because the wild G-forces at play here is a very real consideration that you have to make. And if a careless crew leaves something out, that something can become a projectile during a maneuver that can take somebody's head off. It gives combat in the Expanse another layer of tension. So that's the toolbox that we and the characters of this story have to work with. But the really interesting thing is that these rules and this political and social state of affairs is in a continuous state of flux. Without getting too far into spoiler territory, in every single book, with the possible exception of one, there's this huge paradigm shift or game changer or cataclysm that completely turns the entire setting on its head, and all of the characters are just struggling to keep up with everything. And again, that just goes to show how authentic to the real world the Expanse is, because think of how much has happened just in the past 20 years. Think of how much has happened to all of us just in the past 5 years. You know what I mean? That's a huge aspect of the human experience, is just all of us trying to live our lives and find our own meaning amidst the titanic events around us, and the Expanse does a very good job of selling that. That's why I think the first book is remembered so fondly amongst the people who've read it, because it does such a great job of establishing the status quo and what normal looks like in this universe, so that when all of these insane, history-altering events start happening, you really get the context for how far everything has been derailed. I think it also helps that the main characters we experience this story through are just ordinary working folks. There aren't any larger-than-life, god-slaying heroes in the Expanse. There are just regular people watching history unfold. The main characters of the first book, Leviathan Wakes, are a past-his-prime sort of washed-up detective and an officer working aboard a ship that's designed to scoop ice from the rings of Saturn and bring them back to asteroids. They're people with jobs, and there's a lot of talk about, how much they're getting paid and how they are going to make money after doing the things they do and how to keep from going bankrupt and what's next for their careers and stuff like that. It's not a huge part of the story or anything, but it's just those little nuggets of realism that just sell it all to you. I think it would be easy to take all of these ingredients and make it into this droll sort of Dickensian literary critique on the human condition or a piece of high art, but The Expanse is actually thrilling. First of all, the characters are awesome and they're so richly fleshed out and flawed and entertaining and at times hilarious. And the action is frequent and intense and brutal and exciting in all the best ways. It's a strangely accessible story given the things that I've said about it up until now. It has this swashbuckling charm that you might not know you're getting into when you first crack the book open. You throw in a little bit of existentialism and conspiracy, as well as a dash of maybe the smallness of all of our human problems, and there you have it. That's as broad a picture as I'm willing to paint for The Expanse without going into actual plot details on what happens. And that's going to be your official spoiler warning. If you have not seen the entirety of the Expanse TV show and have not read up until the ending of the book Babylon's Ashes, then beware, because we're going to be touching on a lot of major events that occur over those first 6 books and those first 6 seasons. Because you can't really talk about anything that happens for the final arc of the series, being books 7 through 9, without addressing the answers to some pretty major questions that are raised early in the series, or the fallout from events later on. So if you don't want to be privy to what a lot of the earlier installments of The Expanse are building up to, this might be your cue to jump off, go and read the Expanse books, because they are very good, and then come back and give the rest of the episode a listen if you're interested. Honestly, even if you don't read, and even if you've seen the show and feel like you have a familiarity with what happens, I would still implore you to read the books because A, they're awesome, and B, there's enough differences between the two mediums that it won't feel like a redundancy. For those of you still with us, you don't need to worry. I'm not going to go super crazy into detail about books 7 through 9, and I'm definitely not going to give away how the whole series ends because I think that's something you should experience for yourself. But this is where the spoilers begin, so buckle up. Book 7 of the series, Persepolis Rising, opens up with an immediate bombshell. Where in other books of the series, there was always a 1 or 2 year-long time jump between installments, save for Nemesis Games and Babylon's Ashes, which had no time jump. The revelation in Persepolis Rising is that it hasn't been 1 or 5 or 10 years since Babylon's Ashes, but 30. The Transport Union has now been in charge of trade amongst the entirety of the Ring Network for longer than the entire span of the first 6 books, times 3. Since it took them, 6 books and almost 10 years to find an even remotely stable source of income and employment, the crew of the Rocinante has heartwarmingly stayed together and has grown to include both Bobby Draper and Clarissa Mao as full-time members. And by the way, now's a good time to mention that, and this is your last chance, huge spoilers for the show, our wonderful ace pilot Alex Kamal is still alive and reasonably well. In the TV show, he was killed off because of some unfortunate real-world circumstances. But in the books, his character survives Nemesis Games and Babylon's Ashes, and it's actually some other character that suffers the fate of his TV counterpart. The changes to the character roster and everybody's role in the story was probably the biggest difference between the book series and the TV show. For example, the character Kamina Drummer has this very long and very well-realized arc throughout the TV show. But in the books, she's a much smaller character and, in fact, isn't even mentioned until book 5 of the series. And she goes through a very different development. Whereas in the TV show, she's this amalgamation of a ton of different POV characters throughout the books who were kind of trimmed away so as to streamline the narrative for TV purposes. In the books, the cast of characters is way bigger and way more people contribute to the plot in minor ways as opposed to the TV show in which fewer characters contribute to the plot in major ways. The TV show and the book series alike have been met with wide critical and popular acclaim, but one of the few critiques I have seen directed towards it have been concerning books and seasons 5 and 6, which they say sort of shifted the attention away from the protomolecule situation and the new worlds that we found, just as it felt like we were finally getting answers. And I argue that, the stuff that followed and the explorations of how humans were going to react to those discoveries and the fear of being outdated were extremely important parts to the human story James S. A. Corey was trying to tell. The fact of the matter is the authors greatly addressed those concerns when Persepolis Rising came about, because we finally get to see everything this series was building up to for the first time in full display. The crew of the Rocinante are still together and still at full strength and work as contractors on behalf of the Transport Union, who are the sort of de facto leading body of humanity throughout the 1300 systems that we have settled. Most of the crew's work involves escorting transports to these colonies to deliver food and supplies and whatnot, but occasionally it's implied their more military-adjacent services have been required, or at least the threat of military-adjacent services. Despite the fall of Earth and the subsequent trials that followed it, which are alluded to in this period of time known as the Starving Years, humanity is kind of on the upswing, sort of. There are numerous colony planets that have populations in the millions, and a few of them are even well on their way to becoming self-sufficient, which you could probably imagine doesn't sit well with a lot of the old powers of the solar system who want everything to depend upon them. There's even a great line in Persepolis Rising that says Earth might not even be the most habitable planet anymore. We're finally seeing humanity grow into this expanse that has been the namesake of this series for so long. We finally see that we're sort of shedding our skin and shedding the old ways that sort of ran the show for the first 3 or 4 books. The Belt has seen some pretty major changes too. Marco Inar's whole entire crusade was an effort to keep the Belters from becoming obsolete and from dying out as a result. And now that the Transport Union has given the Belters a reason to more or less exist, we've seen a lot of development on their end. Where Medina Station for the longest time occupied the slow zone and served as a sort of home for Belters there are now new versions of Medina Station, these huge tube-shaped rotating ships that house hundreds of thousands of Belters that are just littered throughout the solar system. There are 3 of them as of the beginning of Persepolis Rising. And these vessels, which are called Void Cities, serve as the sort of capital of the Transport Union. Which, by the way, Kamina Drummer, in one of her few commonalities with her TV counterpart, is in charge of at this point. We're more or less at a period of nothing's ever stable when it comes to humanity, but there's no huge threat of Cold War. We see sort of hints of brewing animosity between the original solar system that contains Earth and the colonies. We see places like Oberon and the Boragaun complex forming organizations such as the Association of Worlds to better push their interests onto the greater humanity project. There are plenty of places that don't hold the Transport Union in the highest regard, and there's this sense in some places that the Transport Union is stagnated or has outgrown its usefulness or has become corrupt over the 30 years it's been in existence. There's a sense that everyone's still trying to figure things out, and some of the critiques against the Transport Union aren't exactly wrong. One of the things the Transport Union does do, however, is regulate traffic throughout the ring gates. They have a system in place that keeps the ring network from being overloaded with mass to trigger the extra-dimensional entities that lurk within, the same entities that consumed Marco Inaros during the finale of Babylon's Ashes. One of the early conflicts in Persepolis Rising focuses on a sort of rebellious colony world called Freehold, which sends a ship through the rings even though They're already approaching the mass limit, and they endanger the lives of hundreds of people in doing so because the ring entities can just at any time kill anybody who's currently transiting through a ring. And this, of course, is when the crew of the Rocinante is called into the story. As much as we love our intrepid, legitimately salvaged Martian warship, the Rocinante at this point is, for all intents and purposes, a rust bucket. It is completely outdated as far as its original purpose of being a modern warship goes. And the crew itself kind of reflects that, because they themselves are sort of getting up there in age. Every one of them is approaching 60, 70, 80 years old, and while being 80 in the Expanse is not quite as advanced in age as being 80 in real life, they're still having to contend with the idea that their bodies aren't what they once were, and that there might come a day where they don't exist anymore. There's talk of what's next and retirement, and can we really stay on this ship forever doing the things we do and enduring the life and the work and the danger that entails, even as we're starting to approach our twilight years. It's super fascinating to delve into the minds of our characters in the first few chapters of Persepolis Rising as they confront these things. We're at the end game, not only of the series, but of these characters' lives, essentially. And there's a certain bleakness that pervades the last 3 books in the series. Things have always been pretty dark in the Expanse series. I mean, a book that involves 1.5 million people dying as part of a scientific experiment in some asteroid and turning into these walking corpses, that's not really light storytelling. But the last 3 books of the series are dark in a way more relatable way, as well as the story developments that happen along the way. James Holden, in the decades of his development, and even in the stuff that we've seen over the course of Nemesis games and Babylon's Ashes, has really taken after Fred Johnson in a very big way, and it's never more apparent than it is in the first few chapters of Persepolis Rising, in which, to quote Fred himself, the sides are changing around him. The Transport Union asks the Rocinante to handle the freehold situation in a way that fundamentally stands at odds with James Holden's character and morals. How he handles that situation, I'll leave to you to find out. But the fact of the matter is, he's almost like this fish out of water who knows what he thinks is right, but sees that the rest of the world is sort of changing around him, and it's almost like he and the rest of the people under his care can't really keep up. But this wouldn't be an Expanse book if there wasn't some looming cataclysm ready to come in and just flip the board over. After all, nobody's heard from the Laconians or Admiral Duarte in well over 30 years. The prevailing attitude amongst the rest of humanity is that the Laconians are currently starving beyond their ring, and once it becomes apparent that they can't survive on their own, they'll come back into the fold. But from what we've seen of Duarte in his very limited page time and his even more limited screen time, is that he's not stupid. That he's a man with a plan. After all, he manipulated the Belters into launching the biggest and most atrocious revolution in all of human history. He nearly murdered the homeworld of humanity as a mere distraction. And Persepolis Rising comes in and says that it's about time that we and the rest of humanity see firsthand what that distraction was all for. And thus the final arc of the Expanse begins when the Laconia Gate, for the first time in 30 years, sends out a visitor. But even as the events that follow begin to unfold and play their course, it becomes apparent that the reckoning that saw the end of the protomolecule builders might be setting its sights upon humanity. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Approaching Lightspeed. I hope you had as good a time listening to it as I did recording it. It might just be because I'm talking about the Expanse, but I really feel like I'm getting into a groove here, so I'm very encouraged about what comes next. Speaking of what comes next, in 2 weeks, you will get to hear part 2 of our little Expanse Spectacular I've got going on. This whole entire month-long block of the Expanse is essentially me getting it out of my system so that I can focus on other things, because I can't not talk about this series. But next time we'll focus on the novellas that sort of have deeper explorations of the Expanse's world than what we get in the main series. In addition to that, I'm going to be sitting down with John Hayes, who is the voice behind the intro music of this podcast, in our first ever Approaching Lightspeed episode with a guest, in which we're going to go into the spoilery depths of the final entry of the Expanse series, Leviathan Falls, as well as the final novella in the series. As always, the gorgeous artwork that is the face of this podcast and which does 50% of my marketing for me, as well as the music that bookends each episode, was made by Alex Shamas, and you can follow him on his website and on social medias via the name Shammanist. And lastly, from the bottom of my heart, I would like to thank you for your continued support. It really does mean so much to me. So I'll let you get back to it. I'll see you in a couple weeks, and in the meantime, I hope you stay safe and that you have a lovely rest of the day. Farewell.